I wasn't supposed to be the one writing this. That's the first thing you need to understand. I was a junior analyst when this assignment landed on my terminal. Fresh out of the survey academy, still running calibration tests on my sensory implants, still figuring out how to sleep in zero-gravity quarters without drifting into the ventilation shaft. Commander HFY had 3 senior analysts ahead of me on the rotation list. 3 analysts with decades of field experience, with commendations on their service walls, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having studied 47 species across 6 galactic sectors. All 3 of them read the preliminary briefing on the humans. All 3 of them put in emergency transfer requests within 48 standard hours. So there I was. The briefing room was cold, colder than usual, which was saying something because Dominion survey vessels run about 4 degrees below comfortable on the best days. Commander HFY sat at the head of the long table, and she looked tired. Not the tired of someone who hadn't slept, the tired of someone who had slept and dreamed something they couldn't shake. She pushed the data tablet across the table toward me without ceremony. "Veth-Kaal," she said, "you're being reassigned." I picked up the tablet. The title on the briefing was standard enough: Species Observation Protocol, Class C Contact World, Designation Earth. But the security classification attached to it was 3 levels above anything I'd handled before. I looked up at her. The others requested transfers. Her mandibles pressed together. I approved them. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Her secondary eyes, the ones in the back of her skull that most Dominion officers kept politely shuttered in social situations, drifted open. A reflex. I'd only ever seen that happen when someone was genuinely unsettled. "Because they've been doing this long enough to recognize something they don't understand," she said finally. "And they're old enough to know they don't want to." She stood up, moved to the viewport behind her. Outside, the gray-blue curve of the planet called Earth hung against the dark. Even from orbit, it looked wrong somehow, not in any measurable, quantifiable way, just busy, like the surface was doing too many things at once. "You're young," HFY said, still looking out. "You still think everything is understandable if you study it long enough." I didn't know what to say to that. "Get started," she said. "We need a full behavioral analysis in 30 rotations." Here's what I knew about humans before I began the study. Not much, honestly. They were a Class C civilization, space-capable but not yet a Galactic Dominion member, not yet part of the formal exchange networks, not yet officially aware that the universe was populated with species that would find them either fascinating or alarming, depending on which civilization you asked. They'd been sending signals into the dark for centuries. Radio waves, mathematical sequences, hopeful little broadcasts aimed at stars they had names for but couldn't reach. They'd been doing that long enough that the signals had reached us, which was why we were here. Standard protocol for a civilization that passes the signal threshold is a covert observation period, minimum 90 rotations, maximum 300 before any formal contact decision is made. During that period, analysts like me deploy to the surface, live among the population in concealment, and compile a behavioral profile that the Dominion Council uses to determine contact classification. Most species at this stage are either terrified of the unknown, they're categorized as retreat potential, or aggressively expansionist, threat assessment required. Occasionally, you get a species that's simply curious and cautious, which gets classified as favorable contact prospect and moved through the standard diplomatic channels. Humans had been observed once before, about 60 of their years back. Brief survey, limited contact, no analysis filed. The only record from that mission was a single line in the Dominion archives. Observation terminated early. Reason: analyst discomfort. Recommend reassessment after species maturation. I thought that was unusual. I'd never seen a report that short. Most analysts wrote 300 pages minimum even for species that turned out to be basically just large fungus colonies. But I filed it away and got to work. The first thing I noticed was the noise. I'd been deployed to a city called Chicago, mid-sized by human standards, large by any other metric I had experience with. My concealment protocol was standard: modified genetic overlay to replicate human physical appearance, behavioral scripting to approximate local social customs, an apartment on the 14th floor of a building that smelled permanently of old cooking oil and someone else's laundry. The noise started before dawn. Not an alarm, not a warning system, just everything. A train somewhere below, the mechanical groan of the building settling into its own foundation. Traffic, those combustion vehicles they still used in large numbers, a technology that the Dominion had retired 3,000 years ago, roaring through the streets with what seemed like completely unnecessary volume. A dog barking several floors down. Music from somewhere, muffled through walls but insistent, a rhythm that didn't match any mathematical pattern I'd been trained to recognize as meaningful. And then the humans themselves. Even at that hour I checked my chrono, it was barely 4 of their morning hours. Someone in the building was awake. I could hear footsteps. Someone talking quietly into a communications device. The sound of water running. I pulled up my first observation log and stared at the blinking entry cursor for a long moment. Then I wrote, "They don't stop." The second thing I noticed was the faces. I'd studied the data scans, of course. I knew what human faces looked like in clinical terms: bilateral symmetry, 43 distinct muscle groups capable of producing a theoretically infinite variety of expressions, visual communication that supplemented and sometimes completely contradicted their verbal output. What the scans hadn't prepared me for was how fast they moved. A human face in a data scan is a static image. A human face in reality is something else entirely. I watched them on the street below my window that first morning, this river of faces flowing through the early gray light, and I couldn't track them. Every 3 seconds, a different configuration. Pleasure shading into irritation, shading into something private and unreadable, all in the span of a glance at a communication screen. A man arguing into a device, face tight with anger, then stopping dead on the sidewalk when something across the street caught his eye. A child, I think, doing something with a bird, and his entire face collapsed into something soft and undefended before he even realized it had happened. I noted emotional range extreme, transitions rapid, involuntary expression appears to be baseline state rather than exception. The Dominion races, my own species, the HFY, the Sorn, the vast majority of the 41-member civilizations, maintain what we consider appropriate emotional regulation. Our expressions are deliberate. Communication of internal state is a considered act, deployed with intention. Happiness is conveyed when happiness is relevant to the current interaction. Grief is private, processed internally, shared only in designated contexts. I watched a human woman cry on a street corner for 7 minutes because, I eventually determined, a piece of music playing from a nearby shop had reminded her of something she'd lost. She didn't appear to know I was watching. She didn't appear to care that anyone was watching. She just stood there, letting it happen to her, while the world flowed past. 7 minutes. No Dominion species I'd ever studied would have done that. I want to be careful here, in this report to be precise. I'm aware that Commander Jethro has flagged this for senior review, and I'm aware that some of my earlier observations were characterized by colleagues as impressionistic rather than analytical. So I'm going to try to be clinical. The humans were, by any standard metric, contradictory. Not in the way that complex species are sometimes contradictory, where different behavioral subgroups have different norms, or where certain behaviors appear under certain environmental conditions. That kind of contradiction is explainable, mappable, predictable once you have enough data. The humans were contradictory within the same individual. The same man I watched argue furiously with a service worker over the cost of a beverage at approximately 8 hours in the morning was, 3 hours later, standing on a subway platform giving his coat to a stranger who looked cold. He didn't know the stranger. He didn't appear to expect acknowledgement. He just did it and stepped back and looked away, like he was slightly embarrassed to have done something kind. I spent 14 days on this observation alone, the coat incident and its variance across the city's population. I watched humans perform random acts of generosity with the slightly pained expression of people who were aware that being openly kind was somehow awkward. I watched them perform random acts of cruelty with expressions that suggested they knew it was wrong and did it anyway, almost as if the wrongness was part of the point. I watched a group of 6 of them spend 3 hours in the rain helping to push a stranger's vehicle out of a flooded underpass. Then those same 6 split up, went their separate ways, and I tracked them individually for the rest of the day. 2 were rude to people at food service counters. 1 was extraordinarily patient with a confused elderly man at a transit kiosk. 1 cried on a phone call. 1 laughed so hard at something on a screen that tears ran down their face. I filed a report. Human behavioral modeling requires nonlinear framework. Standard prediction matrices insufficient. I got a message back from Commander Veth-Kaal that said only, "Keep going." By the 3rd week, I'd started visiting a human establishment called a diner. I know that wasn't entirely within protocol. Passive observation is standard for Phase 1, and the diner required active participation, ordering food, responding to the woman who worked there, being present in a social context rather than behind glass. But I'd realized that the most interesting things humans did, they only did when they weren't aware they were being studied. The diner was called Marta's, and Marta herself was 63 years old, with hair that had gone gray at a speed she seemed to find personally insulting based on how she described it, and the kind of laugh that I quickly came to identify as dangerous, not in any threat assessment sense, but dangerous to composure. It started low, that laugh, and it built. She had regulars. A retired transit worker named Elray who came in every morning at 6, ordered the same breakfast, and complained in detail about the previous night's sports program. A younger woman, couldn't have been more than 22, named Priya, who always had her face in a textbook and sometimes forgot to eat what she'd ordered until it was cold. A man whose name I never learned who sat in the corner booth and stared out the window for exactly 1 hour, drank 2 cups of coffee, and left without speaking to anyone except to say, "Thank you," to Marta on his way out. What fascinated me was not any of them individually. It was what happened between them. Elray didn't like Priya's music. She wore earphones, but apparently not good enough ones. He said so loudly on their 3rd morning of overlapping schedules. Priya pulled one earphone out and looked at him with an expression I'd already cataloged as preliminary hostility. Then Elray said something I didn't catch, too fast, too colloquial for my translation matrix, and Priya laughed. Genuinely laughed. And after that they talked, off and on, between her reading and his complaining, with the ease of people who have decided, without discussing it, that they're going to be in each other's lives in this small, specific way. The man in the corner booth, who never spoke, one morning he arrived looking wrong. I noticed before Marta did, something in the set of his shoulders, something around the eyes. But Marta noticed. She always brought him 2 coffees. That morning she brought him 3, and she set the 3rd one down and she said just this, "Nothing more, hard week." He didn't answer right away. He looked at the coffee. Then he said very quietly, "Yeah." "All right," Marta said, and she went back to the counter. That was it. No analysis of the problem. No offered solutions. No elaborate displays of sympathy. Just the 3rd cup of coffee and the question that didn't demand an answer. And somehow, I watched the man's shoulders drop by approximately 2 centimeters, and the wrongness around his eyes shift slightly toward something more bearable. I sat with that observation for a long time. Then I filed it. I hadn't intended to test this. It happened on a Tuesday. They have a day called Tuesday that carries an interesting cultural weight, mostly negative, though the reasons are semi-mythological at this point, when a water main beneath the street outside the diner burst. The sound was significant, a concussive pressure release that, on my homeworld, would have triggered every available emergency protocol and sent the population of a 10-block radius into their shelters. What it triggered in the humans outside Marta's diner was, first, a full stop. Every human on the street froze for approximately 1.4 seconds. This I expected. Threat response stillness is common across most species. What came after was not what I expected. The freeze broke, and instead of retreat, instead of the orderly dispersal that every behavioral model I'd been trained on predicted, approximately 40% of the humans moved toward the source. Not all of them. Some went the other way, which was sensible. Some stayed where they were, which was a defensible choice. But 40% of the witnesses to a loud, startling, potentially dangerous event moved toward it. A woman with a stroller moved away, which was logical. A man who had been walking next to her left her side, kissed her quickly on the cheek, said something I lip-read as, "I'll be right back," and walked toward the burst pipe. There was no emergency there. The pipe was simply a pipe, flooding the street. No one was in danger. He just walked toward it, and 3 other people walked toward it, and within 5 minutes they were all standing around it discussing what might be done about it with the focused energy of people solving a puzzle they hadn't been asked to solve. None of them worked for any relevant municipal service. I checked. I went back to my apartment and stared at the wall for 20 minutes. Then I filed. Human threat response is highly variable. Significant percentage exhibits approach behavior where retreat is standard expected response. Mechanism unclear. Possible evolutionary artifact or possibly something else. The something else was what started to worry me. I need to break the clinical format for a moment. I'm aware this is a formal document and I'm aware of what's appropriate, but I also think, given the circumstances, given where this report ends up, that the record deserves honesty over polish. By the end of week 4, I was scared. Not in the way I was scared during my training exercises, where the scenarios were designed to be frightening and the parameters were known. In the way you're scared when you realize you've been looking at something the wrong way for so long that you have no idea how it actually looks. I'd been trained to assess species. I'd been taught frameworks, metrics, categories. A civilization either shows expansion aggression, or it shows fearful retreat, or it shows the calm, rational curiosity of a species on a steady developmental arc. Those are the 3 options. That's what 60 years of Dominion xenoanthropology had produced, 3 boxes, and every species fit into one of them. The humans didn't fit. They were aggressive. I had 47 years of their own recorded history to document that. Wars and conquests and territorial expansions that would have made the early Dominion founding wars look modest. And they were retreating. I could see it in individuals every day. The people who pulled back from the world, who hid in small apartments and didn't answer their communication devices, and built walls around themselves with a precision that suggested long practice. But they were also, and this was the part I couldn't categorize, persistently, stubbornly, almost aggressively hopeful. I found this baffling. These were creatures who had, in their own recorded history, survived ice ages, plagues, continent-spanning wars, environmental disasters they had caused themselves, and at least 3 separate moments where it appeared their entire civilization was on the verge of collapse. And they kept going. Not because they didn't understand the danger. They understood it fine. I watched the news broadcasts. I read the analyses. I saw the data on their own existential anxieties. They knew their climate was destabilizing. They knew their political systems were fractured. They knew they were small creatures on a small planet in a quiet corner of a vast and indifferent universe. They built a diner on a flooded street and named it after a woman who laughed too loud, and they kept going. I didn't have a category for that. I'm going to be very precise here, because this is the observation that triggered my formal request for Commander Veth-Kaal's consultation. It was early morning. I was on a bridge, a pedestrian crossing over a river in the gray pre-dawn light, taking readings on the water temperature differential as part of a routine environmental data sweep. There were few humans present. One jogger who had passed me twice already. A man in a bright vest who was examining something on the bridge's railing with a professional focus. A woman came onto the bridge from the far end. She was walking slowly. The kind of slow that isn't peace, that isn't ease, the kind of slow that means something heavy. She stopped about 30 meters from me. She put her hands on the railing. She looked down at the water. I ran a rapid behavioral analysis. The output that came back stopped my next breath. I didn't move immediately. I'll be honest about that. There was a moment of processing delay, the kind that happens when your analytical systems encounter something outside their operational parameters and spend a crucial few seconds simply refusing to accept the data. Then I moved. But I didn't have to reach her. Because the jogger, the woman I'd watched pass this bridge twice already, the woman with the earphones and the steady rhythm who had been doing her morning run with the focused efficiency of someone who needed this, who needed the movement and the pace and the silence, she had also seen. She stopped running at a distance that wasn't close enough to alarm, but wasn't far enough to be ignorant of. She took her earphones out. She stood there for a moment that was precisely long enough. And then she said something I couldn't hear from my position. The woman at the railing didn't move. The jogger took 3 steps closer. She spoke again. What happened over the next 11 minutes, I have the recording, I've reviewed it 17 times, was not a dramatic intervention. There was no movie moment pull back from the edge, no crying, no embracing. The jogger simply stayed. She didn't touch the woman at the railing. She didn't try to solve anything. She stood at a respectful distance and she talked, and gradually the conversation became something two-directional. And gradually the woman at the railing turned slightly, not toward the jogger but away from the edge, and gradually, over 11 minutes, the morning changed. The jogger eventually said something that made the woman laugh. A short laugh, the kind that escapes before you can stop it, surprised out of you by something absurd landing in a serious moment. They left the bridge together. I don't know where they went. I sat down on a bench, and I didn't move for a long time. Then I contacted Commander Veth-Kaal. "I need to talk to you," I said. "I know," she said. She sounded like she'd been waiting. Commander Veth-Kaal came down herself. That was unusual enough to alarm me before we'd exchanged a single word. Survey commanders don't typically deploy to the surface during a standard observation mission. The Corps has protocols specifically designed to keep command-level officers in orbit, shielded from what they politely call observational contamination. The thing that happens when you stop studying a species and start, by degrees, being affected by them. But she came down herself, and she arrived at my building on a Thursday afternoon wearing a concealment overlay that made her look approximately 40 years old and vaguely Central European. And she sat across from me at the small table in my kitchen, and she looked at my observation logs for a long time without speaking. "How many hours of recorded footage?" she asked finally. "Approximately 900, I said, "but it's—" I can see she was scrolling. Her secondary eyes were open again, which I'd noticed she rarely bothered to conceal anymore. "The bridge incident." "Yes." "Tell me what disturbed you about it." I thought about how to say this. The jogger didn't know her. Correct. She had no relationship with the woman at the railing, no prior contact, no evolutionary or social obligation to intervene. The cost of intervention, stopping her run, engaging with a stranger in emotional distress, potentially being associated with a crisis situation, was non-trivial. And yet she stopped. I turned to the window. The city was doing its usual thing below, all that continuous, unstoppable, multi-directional living. I've been trying to find the mechanism, Commander. In every species I've studied, altruism follows a comprehensible logic. Kin selection, reciprocal benefit, reputation maintenance in social hierarchies. There's always a mechanism. And here, I can't find one. I turned back to her. I've run 43 behavioral models. The jogger had nothing to gain. In fact, she had things to lose: time, emotional energy, potential legal entanglement if the situation had developed differently. Every model I have says she should have kept running. Veth-Kaal set the tablet down, but she didn't. We sat with that for a moment. There's more, I said. I'd been keeping a secondary file. Not in the official observation database. In a personal notation file that I'd started calling, privately, things I don't know how to classify. It had grown to 240 entries in 6 weeks, which is more entries than my things I don't know how to classify file had accumulated across my entire prior career. I read some of them to Veth-Kaal. Entry 47, I said. A human man, approximately 60 years old, working a night shift at a fuel distribution facility, maintenance job, low status by local economic metrics, physically demanding, poorly compensated. He spent 22 minutes of his authorized break period teaching a younger coworker how to identify constellations. No context I could find for why he knows this. It appeared to be a personal interest, developed apparently for no other reason than that space was interesting to him. He had star charts on his phone. He knew names. Veth-Kaal was very still. Entry 73, I continued. A group of teenagers, that's their term for the developmental stage between childhood and adulthood, approximately 13 to 19 of their years. A group of them gathered in a park and spent 4 hours building an elaborate temporary structure from natural materials. Sticks, stones, leaves. They photographed it. They left it there. When I checked the following morning, another group, different individuals, no apparent connection, had found it and added to it. Entry 112, I said. This one is harder to describe. I was watching a musician, street performer, no formal venue, dependent on passing donations, playing an instrument called a cello in an underground transit station. The station is not a pleasant environment. It smells, it's loud. The acoustics should have been terrible. The musician was playing something that I later identified as a piece composed approximately 300 years ago by someone who died in poverty and wasn't famous until long after death. I paused. The people in that station, I said. They slowed down, Commander. They're always rushing, that's constant, that's baseline. But they slowed. Some stopped. One man stood with his eyes closed for 2 full minutes while a train went past loud enough to rattle my sensor array. And then the train was gone and the music was still there. And he opened his eyes and he looked. He looked like something had been given back to him. Veth-Kaal was quiet for a long time. What's entry 240? She asked. That one's from this morning, I said. Marta, the diner woman, she got a medical diagnosis yesterday. I know because she told Elroy about it and Elroy told Priya, and it went around the diner in about 20 minutes. Not good news. The kind that means things are going to change. What did she do? She made the coffee. She set up the chairs. She unlocked the door at 6 a.m. and she smiled at the first person who walked in. I stopped. Like the only possible answer to bad news was to keep making the diner be the diner. Commander Veth-Kaal stood up. She walked to my window, and she stood there looking at the city for a long time. You understand, she said finally, that we have a problem. The problem, as she explained it, as she'd apparently been thinking about it for longer than she'd told anyone, was not that the humans were dangerous. Every civilizational contact protocol is built around the assumption that the primary question is, are they dangerous? The Dominion spent 3,000 years developing assessment frameworks entirely oriented around that question. They built threat analysis matrices, expansion potential models, military capability projections. They trained analysts to spot aggression signatures, territorial markers, the cultural indicators of a species that would, given the opportunity, reach for what wasn't theirs. The humans had all of those indicators, by the way. I want to be clear about that. Their history was full of exactly the kind of territorial aggression, resource warfare, and hierarchical brutality that the Dominion threat models flagged as concerning. A purely data historical analysis of the human species would have produced a classification of elevated threat, monitor, and contain. That was actually the recommendation from the previous observer, 60 years back, the one who'd terminated the mission early. He'd looked at the wars, the weapons programs, the environmental damage, the political fractures, and he'd recommended containment. But he'd left too soon, or he'd looked at the wrong things, or both. Because the problem, as Veth-Kaal now framed it, wasn't that they were dangerous. The problem was that they were like us. Not in biology, not in culture or history or any of the surface-level markers, but in the deep structural way, the way a civilization is arranged, what it puts at its center, what it sacrifices for and what it laughs at, and what it builds in the dark where no one is watching. Every Dominion member species that we classify as compatible, Veth-Kaal said, shows a consistent pattern. They organize around survival, yes, around resource security, around social hierarchy. These are universal, but the compatible ones, the ones that integrate, that contribute, that don't destabilize the network, they also show something else. She turned from the window. They show what our theoretical models call meaning-making behavior, creative expression, philosophical inquiry, mutual care structures beyond kinship, the capacity to find value in things that have no survival utility. The cello player, I said. The cello player, the star charts on the maintenance worker's phone, the bridge, the diner, she shook her head. Every marker of a compatible civilization, Veth-Kaal, every single one. But also the wars, I said. Yes, she sat back down. Also the wars, also the environmental damage. Also the weapons programs and the inequality and the cruelty that exists in documented abundance. She folded her hands on the table. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I was starting to. They're both, I said slowly, they're both things simultaneously. In greater amplitude than anything we've encountered. She picked up my tablet, looked at it again. The species with the most documented atrocity in their own recorded history, and the most documented, she paused, seeming to search for the word. Grace. I want to pause here and try to convey what the next few hours felt like in that small kitchen, because I think it matters to the record. We weren't panicking, not yet. What we were doing was something that I've only experienced a handful of times in my career, that particular combination of intellectual alarm and something that wasn't quite wonder but was adjacent to it. The feeling of looking at something that doesn't fit any shape you know, and realizing that the something might be more important than the shape. Veth-Kaal spread my 6 weeks of data across the table in sections. We went through it systematically. We tested every framework we had, compatibility matrices, threat assessment models, developmental stage analysis. We ran the numbers 3 different ways. The results kept coming back the same. Both simultaneously, off the scale in both directions. This shouldn't be possible, I said at one point. Not a complaint, just an observation. An honest acknowledgement that the data was doing something that the data, according to everything I'd been trained to believe about data, should not be able to do. I know, HFY said. The models assume that a civilization's threat potential and its compatibility potential exist in inverse relationship. As one goes up, the other goes down. I stopped. That's the entire basis of the classification system. I know. If both can be high simultaneously. Then the classification system, HFY said, quietly and with the particular tone of someone watching a very large structure develop a crack, might be wrong. Here's what we decided, there in that kitchen. Not decided, actually. I want to be accurate. We didn't have the authority to decide anything at that level. What we did was agree on what the data required, what the next step of the analysis had to be, the step that neither of us wanted to take, but that both of us knew was inevitable. We needed to see them under pressure. Not the routine pressure of daily life, financial stress, social friction, the ordinary grind that I'd been observing for 6 weeks. We needed to see the humans in a genuinely extreme situation. The kind of situation that strips away the practiced social behavior, the cultural scaffolding, the comfortable routines. The kind of situation that shows you what's underneath. HFY had an idea about where to find that. There's a hospital, she said, approximately 4 kilometers from here. I'm going to be very honest about the hospital. I didn't want to go. That's the truth, and I think it belongs in the record. I'd spent 6 weeks watching these creatures, and something had happened in those 6 weeks that I hadn't planned for and hadn't trained against, and hadn't been warned about by anyone except, obliquely, the commander who'd sent me here by telling me I was young enough to think everything was understandable. I'd started to care about them. Not in the analytical sense, not in the professional sense of caring about the integrity of the study. And I recognize this is not the appropriate register for a formal report, but I've been given latitude, so, in the human sense. The way the man in the corner booth cared enough about Marta's diner to show up every morning. The way the jogger cared enough about a stranger to stop running. I cared what I would find in that hospital. I cared because I was afraid it would be bad, and I was afraid that bad would confirm one reading of the humans rather than another. And I had, without meaning to, started to want a particular reading. HFY saw it on my face. She had secondary eyes and she used them. It's fine, she said. It means your observation quality is high. It means I've lost objectivity, I said. In my experience, she said, picking up her coat, she'd gotten a coat, very thick, very gray. The kind the corner booth man wore, objectivity was always somewhat overrated for this kind of work. Come on. The hospital was called Rush. It was, there's no other word, overwhelming, not in a negative sense alone. In the way that something is overwhelming when it contains more information than you can process in real time, and you have to keep flagging portions for later analysis, because your observation systems are running at capacity. There was pain in that building, real pain, the kind you can see and hear, and the kind that sends signals across open space that even a non-human sensory system picks up, because pain at sufficient intensity is universal. I'd known, academically, that hospitals were where humans brought their suffering. What I hadn't processed, academically, was what that actually meant in practice. That humans had decided, as a species, that they were going to put all their suffering in one building, and then send other humans into that building to fight it. The fighters were remarkable. They were tired, that was the first thing. Not the polite tired of a long shift, but the fundamental, cellular tired of people operating consistently at the edge of their capacity. They moved with a particular efficiency that I'd only seen before in military contexts. Purposeful, rapid, economical, every gesture load-bearing. A nurse, I'd learned the role from my cultural briefings, navigated a hallway with 4 things in her hands and a 5th thing on her mind, and a conversation happening with a colleague that she was conducting without breaking her trajectory. A physician sat on a low bench in a corridor and made a phone call that, from the 15 words I caught, was delivering information that would destroy the person on the other end, and his face while he did it was something I can only describe as careful. Precise. The face of someone being very, very careful with the most fragile thing they'd ever been handed. A man, not staff, I determined quickly, family, stood in a waiting area with his hands in his pockets, and his face arranged in the particular human expression I'd catalogued as holding it together. A child came around the corner, his child. The relationship was visually obvious, and in the time it took that child to cross the room to him, I watched the man's face do something extraordinary. He put it away. Whatever was on his face, fear, despair, whatever long night had produced that expression, he gathered it up and he put it away. In the 2 seconds before his child reached him, he rebuilt himself into something steady. He lifted her, he said something, she laughed. He put his face against the top of her head, and I think that was where he kept it for a moment, whatever he'd tucked away, hidden in her hair just for a second. Then he straightened up and he walked her toward the vending machine and he asked her, I lip-read it clearly, what she wanted. We stayed 4 hours. At the end of the 4 hours, Veth-Kaal and I sat on a bench in a small outdoor space attached to the hospital, some kind of garden, a few plants, a fountain that made soft sounds. The evening was coming in, turning the sky a color their atmosphere produces at that hour that doesn't exist in any HFY sky, a kind of layered amber. All right, Veth-Kaal said. Yeah, I said. We sat for another few minutes. So here's my problem, I finally said. I went in there looking for what's underneath, what comes out when you strip everything away, and what I found, I stopped. It's the same thing. It's the same thing that's there on the surface. The contradiction doesn't resolve under pressure. It intensifies. Explain. More fear, more pain, more genuine crisis, and the response is more generosity, more endurance, more. I looked at the fountain. More of the exact thing you'd be least surprised to lose. Facing terrible things and still making the corner booth man a 3rd cup of coffee. Still putting their child's face against their head and asking her what she wants from the vending machine. Veth-Kaal was quiet. Commander, I said, I don't think our framework is just incomplete. I think it's built on a wrong assumption. We assume that any species under sufficient pressure reveals a survival core that overrides social behavior. That kindness is a luxury behavior that falls away in crisis. That's the basis of the threat model. That's what we're looking for when we look for what's underneath. And I think for some species, maybe kindness is the survival mechanism. I turned to look at her. I think the bridge and the diner and the man in the waiting room, I think those aren't exceptions to the human's capacity for brutality. I think they're the same thing, same drive, same fuel, just aimed differently, Veth-Kaal said softly. The species that survives ice ages and plagues and wars they cause themselves. The species that keeps building diners on flooded streets. I shook my head. Commander, they're not dangerous despite their capacity for connection. They're dangerous because of it. Because a species that can feel that strongly in both directions, that can hate that absolutely and love that absolutely and endure that absolutely. I stopped. Yes, Veth-Kaal said. She was watching me with all 4 of her eyes now. A species like that, I said. If you ever need them to be on your side, I looked at the amber sky. You want to make sure you are. What happened next is where my personal account ends and the official record begins. I'm including it here because I was present, because I think the record should have a witness. Veth-Kaal contacted the Dominion Council 3 days after our conversation in the hospital garden. She submitted my full 6 weeks of data, her own analysis, and a formal recommendation that appended 60 years of contact protocol planning, and sparked what I'm told was the loudest argument the council chambers had seen since the Sorn accession dispute of 3,000 years ago. Her recommendation was not threat assessment, contain. It was not favorable contact, standard diplomatic channels. It was something the Council had not received in its entire history. Priority contact, mutual benefit potential extreme. Recommend immediate reclassification and expedited integration process. I heard about the argument secondhand, from Council staffers who found the whole thing unprecedented enough to gossip about. The primary objection, raised by 3 senior Council members, backed by the full weight of the Dominion threat assessment history, was the human war record, the weapons programs, the environmental damage, the unresolved political fractures. HFY, by all accounts, was not moved. She apparently said, and I'm including this because it was relayed to me verbatim by someone who was there, and who described it as the quietest thing said in the loudest argument they'd ever witnessed. She apparently said, "Show me a species with no capacity for destruction, and I'll show you a species that never had to survive anything. The humans have survived everything, and they're still building diners." The vote was close. The integration process is ongoing. I'm writing this final section from a different apartment. Not Chicago anymore. The mission has moved to the second phase, the formal engagement preparation, and I'm based in a city called Vienna now, which is full of that music I mentioned, the 300-year-old kind, and also very good bread, and also, I'm told, exceptional coffee. I think about the man in the corner booth sometimes. I think about whether he still goes to Marta's, and whether Marta's is still there, and whether Elroy and Priya still argue about the music. I think about the bridge. I think about the jogger who had somewhere to be and didn't go there. I've been running the numbers again, not for the Council report, just for myself. The question that I keep coming back to is the one that I couldn't answer in my initial analysis, the one I still don't have a clean framework for. What do you call a species that is simultaneously the most destructive and the most creative thing in its corner of the galaxy? What do you call a civilization that has nearly ended itself multiple times and then, in the smoking aftermath, started building things, not weapons, not walls, but things like music and diners and star charts on a phone in a pocket on a night shift? I was trained with categories: 3 boxes, retreat potential, threat assessment, favorable contact. The humans don't fit any of them. I've been thinking about making a 4th box. I don't have a good name for it yet. The closest thing I have is a phrase I found in their own literature. One of their writers, in a small book, centuries ago, wrote something that my translation matrix initially flagged as statistically improbable, because it's the kind of sentence that shouldn't statistically exist. The sentence was, "They have no idea how bright they are." The writer meant it about an individual, a person they loved, but I've been thinking about it differently. Because sitting here in Vienna, with the coffee and the bread and the music coming through the window, a cellist, as it happens, playing something old and extraordinarily specific, and somehow still exactly right for a Thursday evening in summer. I think about what Commander HFY said on the bench in the hospital garden, and I think about the vote in the Dominion Council. And I think about the 43 senior analysts who have now reviewed my data, and the fact that the phrase I keep seeing in the private messages they send each other, the phrase that keeps reappearing in the footnotes of the formal analyses, is some variation of, "We had no idea." They have no idea how much they terrified us. Not with weapons. Not with their wars or their weapons programs or their environmental damage or any of the things that flash red in the threat matrices. They terrified us with the other thing. The bridge, the 3rd cup of coffee, the star charts, the man who rebuilt himself in 2 seconds for his daughter and asked her what she wanted from the vending machine. The capacity to be, simultaneously, the most frightening and the most. There's a word in one of their older languages. I don't have a Dominion equivalent for it. The closest translation is something like beautiful because it almost wasn't. The most achingly, specifically, stubbornly themselves thing we had ever encountered. Commander HFY sent me a message last week. Very short. She sends short messages. It said first formal delegation arrives in 6 months. Thought you should know. Also, how's the coffee? I wrote back, very good. You were right, by the way. She wrote back, about which part? I thought about it. About the bridge and the diner and the hospital garden. About the jogger who stopped. About the man in the corner booth who said, yeah, it was a hard week, and then came back the next morning anyway. I wrote, about the objectivity. It was overrated. You can't understand something you're not a little afraid of, and you can't be a little afraid of something you don't. I stopped, rewrote it. You were right. That's all. She sent back a single word, which was the most I'd ever seen her express in a personal communication. Obviously, the cello is still playing outside. The window is open because the evening is the amber-layered color, and the temperature is exactly right, and there is, for the moment, no particular crisis requiring my attention. I'm going to finish this document, and then I'm going to get some of that bread, and I'm going to sit by the window and listen to this 300-year-old music that found its way to a transit station and stopped a man in his tracks, and then found its way to a Thursday evening in Vienna, and found its way into a report that a Dominion Council member apparently read twice, and then sat quietly at her desk for a very long time. The humans have no idea. They have no idea what they look like from out here. No idea that we've been watching, that we've been taking notes, that 3 senior analysts requested emergency transfers because the data scared them. They have no idea that the thing that scared us most was not the bombs or the wars or the damage. It was this, the music through the window, the diner open at 6, the jogger who stopped. They have no idea how bright they are. I hope when we finally tell them we're here, when the delegation arrives and the formal contact begins and all the careful diplomatic architecture gets put into practice, I hope someone gets to tell them that. I hope someone gets to say, we watched you for a long time. We ran every model we had. We argued about you in the highest chambers of a civilization 3,000 years old. And what we couldn't get past, what none of our frameworks could hold, was this. You almost didn't make it. So many times. You came so close to the edge and you looked down and you chose, not always, not everyone, but enough. You chose to turn back and make the coffee and open the door and stop running and ask the stranger if it was a hard week. We have 41 civilizations in our network. We have 3,000 years of history. We have frameworks and models and classification systems and the accumulated xenoanthropological knowledge of a galactic government. We had no idea.